Imagine two people earning the same income, living in the same city, facing the same prices, yet over time their financial lives begin to diverge in ways that feel almost invisible at first and then suddenly irreversible. And the turning point is not a promotion, not a business breakthrough, but a quiet number sitting in a bank account, $10,000, or its equivalent, which, at first glance, does not seem life-changing. Yet in practice, it subtly rewires how decisions are made, how risks are perceived, and how time itself is valued. At very low savings levels, money behaves differently because every expense carries emotional weight, and every unexpected cost forces a reaction rather than a choice. So decisions are compressed into the present moment, where survival replaces optimization, and short-term thinking is not a flaw, but a necessity. Because when your buffer is close to zero, the future cannot compete with immediate needs, which is why even small disruptions feel disproportionately large. But when savings approach that five-figure threshold, something shifts, not externally, but internally. Because the presence of a buffer begins to separate urgency from importance, allowing decisions to stretch across time instead of collapsing into the present. And this is where financial psychology quietly transforms. Because the individual is no longer reacting to money, but starting to position themselves around it. Mathematically, the change is not about wealth in the traditional sense, but about optionality, because $10,000 does not generate significant passive income, and it does not replace a salary, but it creates decision space, which is a different kind of asset entirely. Because now a job can be evaluated instead of endured, a purchase can be delayed without stress, and a mistake no longer carries the same permanent consequences. This is also where risk perception evolves, because without savings, risk feels dangerous since failure has immediate consequences. But with a financial cushion, the same risk begins to feel calculated, because the downside is partially absorbed, and this changes behavior in subtle ways, such as negotiating more confidently, walking away from poor opportunities, or investing time into skills that do not pay immediately, but compound later. Historically, this pattern has repeated across different economies and time periods where individuals or groups that cross a minimum financial threshold begin to operate under different rules, not because the system changes, but because their interaction with the system changes. And this creates a divide that is less visible than income inequality, yet often more impactful over time. There's also a mathematical layer to this shift, because once a base level of savings exists, even small returns begin to matter differently, since growth compounds on stability rather than instability, and while the absolute gains may appear modest, the psychological effect is significant, as money starts to feel like something that can grow instead of something that only disappears. At the same time, expenses begin to behave differently, because without a buffer, costs are interruptions. But with savings, they become variables that can be managed, planned, or absorbed, which reduces cognitive load, and this reduction in mental pressure often leads to better long-term decisions, even if the income remains unchanged. What makes this threshold interesting is that it does not represent financial freedom, and it does not eliminate constraints, but it introduces a form of control that did not previously exist. And control in financial systems is often more influential than raw income, because it determines how choices are made under uncertainty. Over time, this shift compounds in ways that are difficult to measure directly, because better decisions lead to slightly better outcomes, which reinforce better behavior, creating a feedback loop that gradually widens the gap between individuals who may have started in nearly identical positions. And eventually, what began as a simple savings milestone becomes an identity shift, where money is no longer viewed purely as something to earn and spend, but as a tool that shapes time, risk, and opportunity. And once that perspective takes hold, the financial system itself begins to look different, not because it has changed, but because the person navigating it has.